Leeds University Business School is running this FT seminar series for quite a long time, and it's quite a well-established event. Last year we decided to kind of create a spin-out from FT Masterclass, which is just focused on strategic innovation. But we wanted to send like 3 messages. The first one is that the business schools are not necessarily just about management in general or about marketing and finance, but we are also interested in innovation. We also wanted to send a message that innovation is quite important. So this is why we usually invite speakers from the companies where innovation is a core capability, and I'm sure that Ray will kind of support this for Siemens. And essentially the third one, that innovation is much broader than just the product development or technological invention. And I think that this brings me back to Ray Thompson, who is head of business development at Offshore UK Siemens. And I think that Ray is a kind of, again, a typical manager which is involved in creation of novelty very broadly. Probably not so much on the technology side, but he is kind of responsible for develop new businesses, and offshore business in UK is pretty much a new business. And by doing this, he has to engage with many different audiences, governments, new suppliers, essentially to build something new. And well, without any further, I would like to give the floor to Ray and to introduce us to kind of innovation strategy at Siemens.
Thanks very much, Christo, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. As Christo said, I head business development for the offshore wind business for Siemens in the UK. So tonight I'm going to tell you just a little bit about Siemens themselves, a little bit about how we approach innovation, what's driving our business, and then move on to how that really turns into practical activity on the ground in the businesses we run in the UK, and particularly my business, which is offshore wind. Just by background, I'm an electrical engineer by profession. Started work in the marine industries, defence, telecoms, IT, power generation, coal-fired generation, facilities management, and probably 1 or 2 others along the way I've forgotten. Then worked for the government for a while doing an economic development role, so linking with the kind of supply chain on offshore wind. And I've been with Siemens now about 2 years, just coming up to 2 years in the offshore wind business. And Siemens is probably a name that you know. We're a very well-known, diverse group. Most people, of course, think of Siemens very much as a German company. But it is interesting that Siemens actually established in the UK before they established in Germany. Going back as far as 1843, young William Siemens came to the UK with a process for galvanising metal, and he patented it first in the UK and established a business before the business got going in 1847 in Germany. And they were really early pioneers, working with things like electronic telegraphs and undersea cables, and so there's a real history of innovation in the business that carries through to this day. Siemens is a huge organisation. Today we stand at around 370,000 employees worldwide, so operating in 190 companies. And that figure actually goes up and down quite a lot as businesses come and go through the Siemens group. In the UK, that's about 13,000 people, of which the wind business I'm involved with is a part. Bit of a busy slide, but really just to highlight some of the facts and figures. I'll let you read through those yourselves. Very intensive investment across the Siemens businesses in R&D. Very significant patent producer, number 2 in Europe in 2012. So very much the kind of innovation is at the core of our business. In fact, when you join a big business like Siemens, you do lots of corporate induction. And one of the things that really gets kind of drilled into you and you get tested on is what our core company values are. And I find it quite interesting because they are responsible, excellent, and innovative are the 3 words that are kind of our guiding principles. And to have innovation recognised, I think, in the very core of your company is very much a kind of Siemens trait. People have often said to me, it's in the DNA, that's what we do. We are an innovation business. And it's quite a fascinating organisation. I talked a little to Christo before the event, and from an organisational development point of view, it's a very fascinating organisation. The first business that I've ever come across that's really made matrix management structures work in an effective way. And as you'd imagine, in a business that size and scale, it's really important that there is those kind of structures, and it's quite a fascinating organisation. Our belief is that research and development complement each other. You've probably seen this slide before, but it's one I kind of like and I've used quite a lot. The people talk about research being transforming money into knowledge. That's where you make the investment, you invest in your research and you gain knowledge. But actually innovation is transforming that knowledge into money. And again, when I joined Siemens, one of the first things somebody told me day one is, they said, we're a company of inventors, but we only invent things that make money. And so that kind of commercial link to the research side is very strong. Research is obviously a very necessary kind of precursor to innovation, but it's not the only thing. And economic value is really created by turning successful research into innovations. And that business strategy really drives our kind of internal research and development strategy. The business strategy of Siemens for a very complex, diverse, international business is actually really quite simple. And again, not on the slide, but one of the things that I was kind of given as a mantra when I started was that our business strategy really fits in a sentence. And the aim for all of our businesses is to be number 1, 2 or 3 in our business sector. Otherwise, we're not going to be in it. And for a very large organisation like Siemens, that's a really concise and simple way of doing things. So I work in the wind business. Siemens is relatively new to wind, but the objective from the start was to be in the top 3 in the world in wind. And just to give you a feel of size and scale, Siemens wind business grew out of a small business in Denmark called Bonus Energy. These were agricultural engineers in the middle of Denmark, starting with very small scale wind turbines. And Siemens acquired the business in 2004 because it saw a growth opportunity in wind. When Siemens bought the business in 2004, there were 850 employees in Denmark in Bonus. And today we're past 9,000. So in less than 10 years, we've grown the business by a factor of 10. And that's the kind of approach that we take to really looking for innovation, looking for technology, and then putting commercial emphasis behind it, commercial might and process behind it. So we focus on technology portfolios for the business. We're very much a technology business, look to effectively use R&D, and then to grow effective business beyond that. But of course, research has to be guided in a direction. And again, we have some very kind of simple principles of the areas of growth that we're looking to develop into. We've called these megatrends, and this is very much a kind of Siemens corporate kind of structure, but these are the things that are really guiding the thinking of our business that filter down into the day-to-day activities that we do. First is urbanization. The figures up there, for the first time in history now, more than 50% of the world lives in cities. And of course you can ask why that's important to a company like Siemens, but when you think of some of the diverse things we do in our group, they're a lot about dealing with those kind of issues. A lot of our business is transport related. Siemens is a big train maker, but we're also looking at the integration of cities, things like smart grids that are very popular right now. And of course there's a really strong driver from that kind of growth of cities to all of our activities. Second is demographic change. You'll be aware that obviously the Earth is facing a huge challenge of population growth, but increasingly also life expectancy, and again the figures are up there. A big part of Siemens' business is healthcare. People don't normally associate us with that, but for example, we're the world's largest maker of hearing aids. Siemens has pioneered the use of CTI scanning and MRI scanning, and are a world leader in that field. And it's interesting actually how some of these things kind of link, and I'll come back to that in a short while. But demographic change is obviously changing the way the population is in the world, and that again links to the urbanization and to the other areas. Globalization. Of course, the world is changing in terms of the way it does business and the way it transacts. Siemens operates in 190 countries, so we are truly a global business. But many of our customers, suppliers, clients are also global businesses. So instead of being focused on a kind of market-led geographical type approach, we very much structure our businesses around the business function and then subset geography underneath, rather than having a kind of Siemens US business. We have wind in Siemens in the US, healthcare, energy, industry. In fact, we even share buildings. My main office in the UK is in Surrey, and I sit alongside colleagues from the infrastructure and cities business, the transport business, the healthcare business. So we very much kind of mix up across, even though we're very functionally divided on the staff tree, we're actually often co-located. And the last is climate change. Climate change is obviously a major factor guiding almost everything else. Again, a big share of Siemens business, about a third, is involved in energy. And whilst we are involved in plant for fossil fuels and others, climate change is driving not just the renewables side, but also the traditional side. So things like coal-fired generation and the gas plant that we produce, there's a real drive to reduce the carbon from those sources as well, both to extend the lifespan of the fossil fuels, but also to reduce carbon impact. Some interesting figures out this week that, depending on whether or not you're a climate change believer or a disbeliever, but there's certainly some kind of controversial facts that CO2 levels are higher than they've been for 400 million years, and there is a link between CO2 levels and temperature. So I've yet to see anything that convinces me that we aren't having an impact, and that really is kind of driving our business. In energy, and particularly thinking about UK market now and energy, government's wrestling with three challenges. So on the right, we have that issue of climate change and how do we decarbonise our energy consumption, our energy production. And on the left, we have security of supply. The UK faces a real problem over the next few years, that lots of the electricity generating plant, particularly that we have, is coal-fired power stations and nuclear power stations that are coming to the end of their useful life. A lot of the environmental legislation coming through Europe will restrict the coal-fired power stations that we have, and a lot of the nuclear stations we have were built in the 60s and are already past their expected life. So we have a real shortfall coming up in the amount of spare energy capacity that's available on the system. Right now we have about 15% additional capacity that National Grid quote, and that's expected to fall to something like 4%. So we're actually going to be quite tight on keeping the lights on. We're trying to balance with those two challenges. Of course, government is wrestling with the central one there, the money. They're trying to deliver carbon reduction, trying to make sure the lights stay on, but trying to minimise the impact to us as bill payers, assuming you pay your electricity bills and your gas bills, which I hope you all do. So it's a real difficult challenge for government trying to balance those things, and that's really what's been driving the energy policy in the UK, is this need to bring forward new investment, the need to hit legally binding climate change targets from Europe, but trying not to overburden the impact to us as bill payers. And part of the reason of that is that if we're going to hit our carbon targets and decarbonise our electricity supply, wind is a crucial part of that. There are, of course, other technologies that are out there. We have a small amount of hydro in the UK, but we don't really have lots of scope to do more. We're developing wave and tidal technologies, but realistically they're probably still at least 10 to 15 years from large-scale commercial deployment. And actually we don't have a lot of other options if we're going to decarbonise electricity production. Of course, we've seen a big upturn in onshore wind. As you drive around the country or travel around, you're seeing we've gone a long way in terms of onshore wind. But of course, that's a finite capacity. You can only go so far. There are only so many good sites and so many sites that are acceptable to the public. So offshore wind is actually the key marginal technology in meeting UK's government targets for carbon reduction. But we are still in an industry that is relatively expensive. The costs of producing electricity from wind are still higher than they are from nuclear or coal or gas right now. And that's the challenge for us, and that's where a lot of the innovation is coming in to our industry, because we understand that the subsidies that the government has put into wind, and offshore wind particularly, won't last forever. So we need to be driving out cost in everything we do to make wind more affordable and more acceptable to the UK. Again, a busy slide, but really this is just about energy policy. Top left is the track that we're on, trying to decarbonise UK supply, and perhaps more importantly, bottom right, is the mix of fuel supplies that we're going to have. And you'll see that the offshore wind is this dark purple colour. We're really at the early stages of that right now. By 2020 we'll have significantly more, and the aim is by 2030 that it will be a big contributor towards the electricity production in the UK. And of course the question always about wind is, well, it's an unreliable resource. Some days it's windy, some days it isn't, and of course that's true. I've never actually heard anybody suggest we should have an energy policy based solely on wind. I think that would be not the brightest of moves. But of course every day that the wind is blowing and producing energy on our system, we're not burning fossil fuels. So even if you're a fan of fossil fuels and coal and gas going forward, wind can help extend the life of those fuels going forward. The other element is cost. As somebody told me recently, every citizen of the EU pays about €700 a year in outflow of funding for fuel. And of course, when you pay your electricity bill, you see it going to the electricity company and you think that they keep it. But of course, what they actually do is buy fuel on open markets. So most of the money, if you track the flow, from your energy bills, certainly your electricity bills, ends in Colombia, because that's where most of the coal comes from for coal-fired power stations, or in the Middle East for oil and gas, or Russia for the gas pipeline. So there's a real kind of outflow of economic benefit from UK and economic union. So wind very much is technology that will help us reduce the reliance on imported fuels, support balance of payments. We had a spell just recently where we had very good wind resource, and wind was running pretty much flat out for about a fortnight at the time when gas prices were at their highest. And the economic benefit to the UK from that is pretty massive when you look at the amount of gas that was displaced that the UK didn't need to buy. Offshore wind, just some facts and figures. Onshore wind, I guess everybody knows about because it's there and you see it. Offshore wind, you probably know less. But actually we've been making some really good progress. The government and the Crown Estate, which is a kind of pseudo-governmental body that owns the seabed, has actually really been quite successful in subsidising and bringing forward offshore wind in the UK. In fact, now the UK has more offshore wind than the rest of the world put together. We think the Germans and the Danes and others are all leading, but actually we've got more than anybody else. And we've moved very quickly. Last year, 25% of new energy plant across Europe was wind, and we've got the biggest pipeline. Looking forward, we are the big market for offshore wind worldwide, which is why there's such interest from the very large companies and industrial players such as Siemens. And last year, about 5.5% of the electricity demand, if you look across the year, was met by wind in the UK. I check it pretty regularly, actually, when I do these kind of talks. I often check the figures just before I come in, but I'm not going to tell you today because it's not a great wind day, but normally it can be quite high. Sometimes it's something like 15% of the electricity production on the system can be wind, but we're quite a light day today, so it wasn't too much when I checked this morning. And the photo to the left, I'm sure you've noticed, is beginning to introduce just how big some of the stuff that we make for offshore wind actually is. That's one of our blades being moved, and you'll see that the lorry at the front is leaving the roundabout, and the lorry at the back hasn't arrived at the roundabout yet. We are making good progress, as I said. In 2012, we actually built the world's biggest wind farm, and I'm going to cover a little more detail about that on the next slide. We passed about 3 gigawatts of capacity of installed offshore wind, and it is a growing business. Companies are investing in the UK. Last year we recruited 350 new service technicians from our base in Newcastle, in my part of the world. And of course, the more wind farms we build, you always need to keep increasing the service staff. Even if you're installing the same amount you did last year, you're cumulatively adding. We probably have about, I guess, something like 1,500 staff working on wind and wind projects in the UK right now as Siemens. But going forward, the investments that the UK is about to make are a huge capital investment. We're looking at over 100 billion of capital investment in wind to meet the UK's programme. So of course people talk about Crossrail as a big project and the Olympics as a big project, and actually they're pretty small in comparison to what we're proposing for offshore wind. That's the figures for Europe, so that's the growth. The dark bars are the in year, and I think the light bars, yes, the light bars are the cumulative. So you see this is an industry that's experiencing real growth from almost nothing in the 90s through 11 and 12. We actually have a bit of a challenge that 13, 14 maybe a little leaner than we've had, that we'll probably struggle to sustain that growth quite so much. But across Europe, this is a massive industry. Just to give you a feel of the scale of the employment, the supply chains producing the onshore wind turbines that you see employ over 100,000 people in Germany, Denmark and Spain today. And the supply chains for offshore wind will be bigger. So that's the kind of prize that's on offer. I mentioned the largest project. This is a project called London Array, which you may have read about or heard in the press, recently being completed. It was developed by a consortium of companies, Dong Energy, the Danish utility, E.ON, German utility, and Mazda. So we are starting to see interest now from UAE and other kind of sovereign wealth funds looking and investing in wind projects as they mature. It has 175 turbines of 3.6 megawatt each, 2 substations offshore and onshore substation, and it's now running its full capacity of 630 megawatts. So that's the equivalent of, I guess, a medium-sized coal station, or certainly one unit of a very large coal-fired station. And just to get in scale the challenge of that, we managed, in partnership with the client, to erect all 175 turbines in about 11 months. So actually, while it's been a very difficult process in the past and projects have had kind of long construction times, we've actually got quite good at this while nobody was looking, and we are now turning out these projects very effectively. And that, of course, helps reduce cost and support the business case. We'll do it for time. This is looking forward. The projects we've done to date, you'll see are the small red dots. They were what was called round 1, so these were the early stage kind of demonstration projects. This is London Array in the Thames Estuary, and we're busy building a number of projects in the Humber Estuary. Of particular interest is these green areas. So this is what's called the round 3 zones. So the leases have been awarded to typically utility clients to develop those areas for wind farms. And just focusing on this one top left, the very large one, you'll see there's a real challenge with that project. Some of the turbines that we put up in the North Sea out there would be 200 miles from the shore. It's an area that if we overlaid from here would cover between Leeds and Blackpool. So we're looking at massive areas of potential development in the North Sea. And that one's slightly odd that it's so far away, but of course that's because of water depth. It's an area where the seabed is relatively shallow, so it's easy to put foundations on the seabed. So the zones look slightly oddly placed, but it's really driven by that. But this is the biggest wind project in the world, this kind of round 3 zone, 9 different development consortium development, and this is really where the big upturn in the economic growth is seen for the UK, and the big opportunity for UK companies, UK suppliers and foreign direct investment to come in and support this project. So as I said, the UK government and the Crown Estate have done a really good job of positioning UK really right at the heart of offshore wind, and that's why all of the international providers and turbine manufacturers are so focused on the UK. I mentioned a couple of times the challenge of bringing down cost. And if you do a historical analysis of wind looking across kind of our portfolio, what happens is that about every decade, about every 10 years, the cost comes down by about 40%. So eventually we'll get down to the point where the baseload energy price, the price of other fuels, gas, coal, nuclear, and wind converge. The challenge we're in right now and what's driving our innovation is to get that slope steeper so we hit that point earlier. So subsidies will run out, and we have to get to the point as offshore wind that when there is electricity capacity required, we can do it without subsidy and our costs match those of other technologies. We'll be there with onshore wind in this decade. Already that kind of trajectory is set, and in other countries, particularly in some of the South American countries where other competing technologies are quite high, wind is already at parity, so it's as cheap to build wind energy as it is for others. The innovation comes through how we get there, and of course that's reducing every element of the cost of projects. The capital expenditure at the start, the operational expenditure of maintenance and keeping it going, and increasing the energy production from the turbines. So a lot of our innovation and technical innovation and focus is really geared about making those things, of making the turbines cheaper, more reliable, but producing more energy. I'm not going to go through all the detail of this, but really three main elements: the blades, what we call the nacelle, which is the generator unit, and the tower. And all of our work is geared around how do we do everything cheaper, how do we get more energy per turbine out, because that improves the business case for the investors, the developers that are going through. So we're doing a lot of work of technical innovation and technical design and R&D on blades. Blades, if you've noticed some of the latest onshore machines now, the blades are very much an S shape. And so we're preloading the blades so they're straight and under wind load. So there's lots of aerodynamics techniques, lots of new material science coming into the blades. In the generators, we are very much moving towards a different design of generator. And without getting too technical, instead of having a gearbox and lots of moving components, the blades now simply turn the generator at low speed. So we've reduced the number of moving components by about half. And whilst it doesn't save you any money in the short term, clearly maintenance, lubrication, faults in the future, reliability should all increase very significantly as a result of that. And we're even being innovative on things like towers. You'd imagine it's just a steel rolled tube, but we're looking at sections, bolted sections, all kinds of clever construction techniques for the towers. And then of course there's the bit underneath the water, the foundations, and people are looking at concrete designs, steel designs, all kinds of ways of reducing the cost. I mentioned a little bit about the blades. Really we are pushing the boundaries, I think, of some of the R&D and the technical innovations on blades. Despite the size of the blades, and I'm going to show you some more photos of the big stuff in a second, we make those blades in one piece, and that's quite a manufacturing challenge. So a lot of the innovation is not just about the turbine, it's actually about the manufacturing processes to get there. Obviously the joints are the weak spots if you mould it in different parts and join them together. So we're very much progressing with a fiberglass type solution, relatively low cost, but high complexity to make. I mentioned that we're moving towards direct drive design, incorporating permanent magnets, so we don't have a gearbox, so you've got a lot less moving parts, a lot less weight in the turbine. That means that you can install it with a smaller vessel. It's easier to maintain, costs should be lower. And of course that all helps the energy production. We're really looking at squeezing every last drop that we can out of the wind and getting the most that we can out of these turbines. The business case for the developers and the utilities and the people putting the money in really depends on the number of hours that you can get out. So a lot of the innovations are actually quite subtle. One of the things that we've recently developed for the blades is a thing called dino tails. And if you imagine the little serrations on the back of a dinosaur's tail, you're seeing that a lot of our blades are now have those added on. And there's some very clever aerodynamics and science around the breaking up of the flow of the wind and those kind of things. But it actually gets about another % of energy yield from the turbines. Now that doesn't sound a lot, but of course if you've got several thousand of those turbines out in the North Sea and you can keep them spinning and keep them spinning at lower winds, then obviously you're driving down that cost through innovation all the time. I've mentioned the technology, but of course the innovation isn't just R&D and technology innovation. As well as being smarter about the turbines we make, we have to be a lot smarter about how we make the turbines. One of the things that's really driving that right now is economies of scale. And of course, the more that you make of something, the cheaper it gets. We'll never be at a kind of automotive level of production and throughput that the car manufacturers make. But this is an equivalent to some of our other businesses, for example, making trains, where you may be in the 400 to 1,000 scale of production a year. And you really need to bring in lean processes and make sure that you are fully optimized in your internal processes, but also fully optimized with your supply chain. To date, wind projects have been a little bit more of a kind of project-focused business, a bit bespoke, a bit developed, for each one, and we really need to get towards a standardised product that we can produce and reproduce at lower cost. We'll also be innovative in the way we approach those global supply chains. One of the benefits of being a large international company is you can really lever the global economics of that. So, for example, on nuts and bolts, clearly an organisation like Siemens is buying on a worldwide scale, and we have massive purchasing power across our businesses. But there are some real economics that work for the UK. For example, if you imagine the very large towers that we need for offshore, clearly the labour element of that could be done cheaper in a low-cost economy in the Far East or in India or elsewhere. But actually the logistics costs of moving huge tubes 100 metres long, 7 metres diameter, which are basically just fresh air halfway around the world, really don't stack up. So there really should be some good, strong economic drivers for investment into the UK. We're very much focused on the lean manufacturing kind of process and improving our productivity, and it's not by accident that our recently appointed head of the wind business globally is someone with an ex-automotive background and a production engineering background. So the whole industry is gearing up to move towards a much more industrialised scale. And I've mentioned at the bottom there, that includes the whole value chain. Our normal scope of supply is Siemens is to supply the turbines and the towers, but we've really got to optimise cost across all of the elements. And of course, when you're building a wind farm, it's also the foundations, the cables, the substations and all the other elements that go to make it connect and make it work. One of the real challenges is on service, and this is a slide that I've borrowed from my colleagues in the service business. And if you think about that project I showed before that might be 200 miles offshore in the North Sea, it's not as easy as putting a guy on a boat every morning and sending him out with a bag of tools and bits to go and mend it. We're going to have some real challenges of maintaining this equipment in far shore environments. So we're already piloting things like having our technicians stay on hotel vessels on the wind farm rather than come in and out every day. In fact, the London Array project I showed, although it's only between 12 and 20 miles offshore, we actually had the technicians on a hotel vessel. So the guys go 2 weeks on shift, 2 weeks off. And partly we're doing that to learn how we're going to do it when we get really far offshore, because obviously the transit times become a real issue. Extensive use of helicopters for getting in and out, very large platforms. So we'll be moving towards what they have in oil and gas, with very large structures in the sea, supported by helicopters, equipment, men going in and out, but that being a base within the wind farm, both during the construction phase and during the service phase when the farms are built. So again, lots of innovation required on the service side, just how we meet those challenges. And this is something that we've never done before. One of the issues that I talk about sometimes when I do this kind of thing is actually that North Sea environment. And if you imagine what we're trying to do, if you imagine a single turbine out off the shore, we're looking at a piece of capital kit that might have a £5 million value, but it's about 120 metres in the air, in about 60 metres of water, about 200 miles from the shore. And all of the photos that I've showed you, the turbines, we love the nice flat blue sky, calm sea photos. Of course, anybody that's ever been in the North Sea or worked in oil and gas will tell you it's not like that. And one of the big challenges for wind is, of course, we are choosing the most windy places we can find to put these turbines, which is great when the blades are all fastened on and spinning round. But when you're trying to build it, it's a nightmare. One of the things with the blades, of course, is that they are very long, but incredibly light. They have a density quite similar to polystyrene foam. So if you leave them lying around on the dockside on a gusty day, they will take off. So there's a real challenge in moving and handling and installing the blades. Imagine trying to do that 200 miles offshore in the middle of winter in the North Sea. So some real kind of technology challenges and environmental challenges that we face. But of course the UK is well equipped for that. One of the real strengths that we have is we have a very mature, established offshore oil and gas industry, and some of our kind of competing nations really don't have that. Innovation again goes beyond the product. We are now really starting to look at the way that we sell and the way that we market turbines. We've stopped selling turbines. Instead of a customer coming to us and say, I'd like 100 of your latest design, we're really needing a different relationship now to work in partnership, to design the wind farm, to lay it out, to work on the consenting, to work on the maintenance strategies, and really to work jointly on a business case to drive down costs. Simply selling turbines is gone, I suspect, for offshore wind. So there's innovation in that respect as well. I've mentioned in service, training is another area. We face an enormous challenge in gearing up for this. The picture shows one of the bays of our training centre in Newcastle, and you'll see we've got complete wind turbine components in there. We'll train about 1,000 technicians through that centre over the next 12 months. In fact, they're running shifts, that there's so much demand to meet the demand from technicians to get on the equipment and be trained that we're having actually to do the training in shifts. I've mentioned a couple of times that wind turbines are getting larger, so here's some of the photos. The top left shows the moulds being prepared for the blades. That's a 75-metre long blade, so an individual blade. Top right is the kind of, if you're familiar with London and the Girton building, that's where the turbines are kind of headed for offshore. And the bottom photos show our first prototype machine. We are moving towards this direct drive design. In the early stages of that, we've made massive investment in the technology, but not yet delivered that into projects. So we're at the prototype stage now. We have 2 up onshore in Denmark, and the bottom centre photo shows that being lifted, and some of the issues around transport for the blades. Key point here, of course, in terms of supply chain development for the UK and what the UK can do, of course, we're looking at portside facilities. When you get to offshore wind scale components, nothing's going anywhere by road anymore. It's just not practical. We've managed to do it for the one-offs for the prototypes, those photos in Denmark, but of course it means closing the roads. And if you want to do 30 a week, 5 a day, or whatever the kind of run rate is, it's just not going to work. So we need portside facilities, and that's one of the things that's a real challenge for the UK in terms of developing its supply chain. A bit of theory into practice. After all that talk about the design, that is the second prototype up in Denmark. A photograph taken actually using a UAV that we hired a drone to try and get some photos. It's one of the difficulties about offshore wind turbines. It's hard to photograph and get any concept of the scale. Either you're so close to it that it just plots out the skyline, or you're so far away it just doesn't look very big. But I think this is quite a good one. Those little dots down there are people, and you'll see the scale from the scale of the vehicles, just how big a kind of structure we are looking at. So for each turbine offshore, we're probably looking at a structure well over 1,000 tonnes, counting the turbine, the tower and the foundation. So a big kind of engineering challenge to make those structures. To get the context of how big that rotor is, there's one next to an aeroplane. It's not an aeroplane, it's the A380. That's the world's biggest airliner. And you'll get a feel of the scale of just how big a kind of machine we are talking about. It's mind-numbing when you're next to it. It's hard to explain until you kind of stand next to it. I mentioned that we're at kind of the early stages. We've passed a significant milestone this year that we've moved to installing the first 2 of these giant machines in UK waters. Again, working with Dong Energy, the Danish utility, we put 2 up in a project called Gunfleet Sands in January this year. There they are being installed and now running very satisfactorily and on test. One more innovation, of course, one of the things that offshore winds had to do is not just build the turbines, but actually build a complete set of infrastructure behind it. So you'll see we're using these kind of jack-up vessels now that are a great way of carrying the turbines from the port out to the wind farm, carrying sets of components on the deck, and then when they get there, of course you can't very easily lift from a moving ship and try and handle that very heavy components. So they have legs that are jacked down onto the seabed, the ship raises itself out, and then the components can be lifted even if the sea is quite a high state. The turbine is fixed, the vessel is fixed, so actually you can operate in harsher conditions. So innovation coming through, not just in the turbines, but in every aspect of what we do. And that, I think, was the last slide. So I've left plenty of time for questions and answers. I'd be happy to take any questions.